13 Principles of Faith are probably the one of the best known writings of the Rambam. You've got the Shachrit and the Siddur, you've got people to read it off each time. What most people don't realize is that Rambam didn't actually write those 13 principles. It's someone who we don't know who it is who abbreviated it from his writings and sort of debated the extent to which the Rambam would agree with the way it's been abbreviated. Like everyone who tries to clarify and represent an earlier work, it's always a discussion: have they done it faithfully? Have they done it well? Yigdal is another sort of version of trying to redo the 13 principles. So they definitely are very popular. They're very well talked about. And to the extent that, definitely in today's discussion, we always talk about people who is an Orthodox Jew, who is a faithful Jew, someone who accepts the 13 principles of faith. And it's sort of become this sort of thing that people accept or don't accept. Is it in the 13 principles? Is he a heretic? Is he not? Is he accept the 13 principles? What's very interesting is something I had the feeling this was true, and I sort of read sort of Joshua Berman, his book on Imam, and he actually sort of had gone through and done the actual work on it. It's only relatively recently that the 13 Principles of Faith took on this role of importance. If you look at the poskim from the Shulchan Aruch, he gives the Bach, he brings the Avnei Nezer, all of the big poskim, when it comes to matters of faith, is someone categorized as a heretic or not, they all went to the Rambam's got another list in Hilchos Teshuvah, Hilchos Teshuvah chapter 3, where he says what is a heretic, what is a kofar, what is this, and he sort of gives the very clear definitions. And so for centuries, that was the principles. That's the question. That's the question. The first question. That's. I have a whole book chapter. Talmud reclaimed how to be a heretic according to the Talmud, because people want to be a heretic. You have to know which principles you don't believe in. So I go through these various different lists of principles of faith and the possible differences between them, and why there are differences. So all the big poskim, all in terms of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, they all looked at the Rambam's Hilchos Teshuvah, which is a legal work, to say is someone legally categorized as a heretic. No one went to the principles of faith. The principles of faith were used; they were part of the tefillah. People used them. Yigdal was made into a song, so they were definitely part of people's. No one rejected them; they weren't sort of dismissed. But when we were looking for a psak, it was always until probably 100, 150 years ago. That's when we started. I think Ramosha Feinstein started bringing it in terms of his teshuvas of what's considered a heretic. But until then, it was never they were never really the source for what's considered a heretic.
What is he suggested? I'm not sure if he actually really think that's true, but that he suggested is that the whole argument not help with the principles, but he basically gave us as a response to the generation, because in those days a lot of other states and nation like the Muslims, the Christians, like their belief are very clear, like, I don't know what's the word for it, doctrines, and they asked do that. What do you believe in? Like, for me, for two, was difficult to answer. Well, you don't have to answer such a thing. You believe in this. So therefore, he came up with an answer. But again,
part of that is the people who try to, because again, one of the things with the Rambam is that everyone looks at the Rambam and they see themselves in it. From the Hasidim to the Reform to everyone is able to take because he is such a broad thinker and he was writing at such a high level, and there are always people that will take one part of the Rambam and that's really what he meant, and everything, and all groups do it to some extent. So you got the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah, of all of that, and then people try, well, how do you fit in the Aristotelian part of it? How do you fit in that? So those, I think, there's one of the writers called Strauss, he had a whole school of Talmidim in the academic world, who came to the conclusion that Rambam didn't really believe in God, and all the writings he read about halacha and God was just sort of cover up. You wouldn't realize it's actually quite a crazy theory. But the people who did that, so they would all go and say, well, the principles of faith. He didn't really hold that. He didn't really have any faith. But again, it's quite a, even in academia now, this kind of approach is falling out because it's quite an extreme view.
So I think he just felt like Judaism doesn't adopt things that are probably not adopt things either, but he just had to give that.
So that's the next. All right, so we'll come on to that in a second. So the first thing I wanted to just point out that we've got the Rambam's 13 Ikarim here, which we're going to go through, and we also have. So I go through in the book to showing each one side by side how they compare. We've also got his definitions in Hilchos Teshuvah, and sometimes they align, sometimes they don't quite align. And there are two main approaches as to why there are differences. One is that Rambam changed his mind. He wrote the 13 Principles of Faith in his younger years, and he was late 20s, maybe early 30s. Whereas Hilchos Teshuvah was a later work. So there are some that say that he changed his mind between one and the other. Although we do also know that the version of Hilchos Teshuvah of Pirush Mishnayos, which is part of Rambam, updated through his life. So he went through, and we know we have a later version, possibly not the last version, but the one that we have is a later version. We know because we've got some corrections, and he said himself he's correcting it. So the other school of thought tries to reconcile them and say that Hilchos Teshuvah is a more concise version, and the principles are, when you elaborate it in more detail, we'll probably come on to there, is that even with trying to elaborate on it, they don't all match up. The approach I try and take in my Talmud Reclaimed it's similar to Joshua Berman, is that Mishnah Torah and the Principles of Faith just a different agenda. It's a different agenda completely. Hilchos Teshuvah is a legal work, and if you look, how did the Rambam put together Mishnah Torah? So he's got a letter he writes to, I think it's called Rav Pinchas Hadayan, one of the rabbis in Montpellier in France, who's criticizing him for not writing the Makoros. It's a bit of a sore point between the Rishonim, why the Rambam wrote Mishnah Torah without bringing all his Makoros, all his sources in the Gemara, so they could check it up and see if they agree or not. And his response was, still not everyone was happy afterwards, but the way he saw it, he's not writing anything original. Everything in Mishnah Torah is just clearly there in the Gemara. And any time he's writing something original, and you find this 50, 60 times in Mishnah Torah, not very often, he'll write something like Yira Eli or Nir Eli, or Kach Nir Eli. He says, unless it's something, then he's making his own Kiddush. Then he thinks it's not so clear and he has to present something. But if it's not that, everything he writes is just a clear sugya, and anyone who reads the Gemara properly is going to agree with him. So he doesn't need to write them to sources. The Rambam didn't necessarily agree with that, but what we see was whether we agree with it or not, Rambam's agenda in writing Mishnah Torah and Hilchos Teshuvah, so the definitions of heresy you have in Hilchos Teshuvah are definitions which he would have thought come clearly out of the Gemara. He's not going to write anything in Hilchos Teshuvah which isn't, in his view at least, clearly in the Gemara. Whereas, if we look at what he writes at the end of the 13 Principles, it's a funny way he does it. His introduction to the Principles really comes after them. He's saying that if you're confused by something in these principles, don't take it lightly. Don't just sort of smooth over and say, "Oh, I've made a mistake," because you got to think about it and go over it more than one time or even more than 10 times. Because can you like about it? I didn't just write this based on what flew into my head once. I spent a great deal of time analyzing and thinking. I went through what is correct, what isn't correct. I was balancing up. So I put together based on all different sources, all different inyanim. So really, what it seems to be, the way I understood it, is that Mishnah Torah is based on Rambam's analysis of what just comes up from a simple reading of the sugyas, whereas the 13 Principles of Faith is Rambam's own analysis of the way he would interpret sources, even if it's not the simple reading of the Gemara. So we have these two different. So the Rambam isn't necessarily contradicting himself. He's got two different agendas. This is his own view. Rambam as a parashan, or a philosopher, or an analyst, or a Baal Machshava, and Mishnah Torah is Rambam as a posek. And sometimes with all different Rishonim, when they're giving a psak halacha, they'll say, "I'm bound by what the posek in the Gemara seems to say." But if I had my own view on the subject, I'd say something else. So sometimes psak and a drush, they don't always match up. And that is why I think there's a difference between the Rambam in the 13 Principles and the Rambam in Mishnah Torah. And there's why I think for all these centuries, when you had Psak Halacha, Avnei Nezer, the Bach, and all these other ones, they went straight to Mishnah Torah. That's Rambam as a posek, paskening based on the way he sees the sugas aligning. Whereas the piyutim, which is more to do with machshava, and the things we have in the siddur, they always go to the Yud Gimel Ikarim rather than to the dry legal code. Nowadays, we don't seem to have that distinction so clearly anymore, and that's one of the reasons why I put them together in this book. Yes, but I go through that a little bit more, but that has its own things about what his conclusions are on Moreh Nevuchim. But yeah, I have the same idea that Mishnah Torah is his psak, and Moreh Nevuchim will sometimes bring in things like when he goes into Ma'aseh Merkava, is one of the controversial points. What is Ma'aseh Merkava under the Rambam? He'll say straight off, I don't have any tradition for this. I believe the tradition's been lost. I'm now going to write to you what it seems to be based on my own analysis. I know I might be wrong. People have a go at his Ma'aseh Merkava without they skip through his introduction where he's saying, I don't have a tradition on this. As far as I'm concerned, the tradition's been lost. So it hasn't come down to me. Therefore, I'm going to write down, if I'm correct, then I don't want it to get to what I think to be lost. And if I'm incorrect, just know this is my own analysis of my Merkava. Whereas you never write that something in Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah is, this is the conclusion of the Gemara, therefore I'm writing it down as a psak. Which comes on to another point, which is, you've got various people who've written books saying that whether someone is a heretic or not is not a matter of halacha, it's not a matter of psak. We don't pass. It's close to what you were saying before. We don't pass in matters of belief. We don't pass in matters of heresy. Yeah. Yeah. Right. They did. Whether they understood what he was saying in the first place to say that or not, there's a separate discussion. Because his principles, his definitions of heresy became incorporated into Shulchan Aruch and been accepted by everyone, pretty much. What do you mean? Well, one of the main people who stood against him was Rabbeinu Yonah, who, again, from what I heard, wrote a letter saying that he repented that. He went to Rambam's grave to ask for teshuvah. The Rambam, who's a Kabbalist, wrote a very strong letter saying that even if we disagree with Rambam on certain points, he's certainly not a heretic, and he's brought Jewish belief in the right direction very much. Again, he had. I think even within a generation or two, the problem that people had is that some of Rambam's students, as Ibn Tibbon, they took what the Rambam said and they almost Aristotelianized, I don't know if that's a word, Aristotelianized him, and they emphasized everything that he said in terms of philosophy, and they sort of downplayed everything he said in terms of halacha, and said, it's like a thing I said about Strauss. They sort of said, well, Rambam was he was so great in philosophy, it can't be that someone who's really so great in philosophy really could have carried out all these things. Therefore, it was just a cover-up, and this was his real opinion. And some of them ended up not keeping halacha properly and downplaying. So people had a big problem with his students, but I think all the great Rabbanim came to accept. Again, I know Rav Nachman had a thing about Moreh Nevuchim. That's a separate discussion. But in terms of the Shulchan Aruch and all these sort of the Rishonim that came after him, to the extent that his positions on not just halacha but even heresy were incorporated into the Shulchan Aruch, and I don't think there's anyone that gives a psak on it without going either to the 13 Ikarim or to the. How many years were there between Rambam and? Well, the Ramban was a generation or two afterwards. Not even a generation afterwards, and he was the sorry. There was a few centuries, but I'm saying, but the reason that Rav Kara brought him in was because even those who disagreed with him on many points, like the Ramban, right? Yeah, you've got the Ramban's commentary on Chumash. He's very fiercely opposed to the Ramban on many points, but he's the one that wrote a letter opposing those who call them heretics, saying you don't understand what you don't understand him. Everything he says is holy, and I think Rav Kook even is reputed to have said that it's a great hashkafa that we had the Rambam, who was able to act as a handbrake on Kabbalah, who sort of kept everything within a certain framework and stopped it from skidding off too far. It was almost like you had the Rambam on one side, Kabbalah on the other side, and things kind of met in the middle, because he's a bit of a framework. When you look at the early Kabbalistic works, Shari Ora, some of the great Kabbalistic works of the Rishonim, their introductions are basically quoting the Rambam as a framework. Everything he says about attributes and not taking God's descriptions of God's physicality and attributes literally. These are things which all the great Kabbalists said before they went on to other things. So yeah, this is a whole discussion in its own right. But okay, I was thinking as it was accepted even by Rambam's opponents in the generations that followed, his definitions of heresy were the definitions. The question comes in now is there such a thing? Another principle that Rambam and others bring down is that there's no such thing as a psak on a matter of agada, on a matter of midrash, on a matter of theology, philosophy, something like that, something which doesn't have enough min halacha, something which doesn't have any halachic implication. We don't have psak. So if one Rishon interprets a pasuk regarding Avram and Sarah one way, Ramban says one and Rashi says the other, we don't pasuk them one to be right or not. We can say Elu ve'elu, it doesn't affect us. We can contain them both. Shouldn't pun on Torah. Similarly, the Rambam brings actually in Peker Chelek also. There's an argument between two different Tanoim about whether I don't remember which generation it was. Whether the generation of the flood thing, whether they got a share in the Olam Haba or not. The one Tana says yes, one says no. And Rambam says we don't have to apply the Klali Apsak here because the heavenly court can do what they want. We don't have to pass before that. We can find out after 120 years. And even when it comes to matters of atonement for us, there's a machlokes in the Mishnah about a certain korban, which sort of sins it atones for. And again, the Rambam says this is a matter of the heavenly court. This is something which we can go up after 120 years. It doesn't affect us. We don't have to act differently whether this carbon oilize atones for these sorts of sins or those sorts of sins. So some people try to take this to say, well, matters of heresy, there's the same thing. Go on, sorry. Interesting. I'm not sure because the carbon can be brought and it can atone for thoughts of sin or a lack of an opportunity of doing an avera, but it doesn't make enough commitment for you. You bring the carbon regardless, and whether it's atoned for you or not. Whether or not his sin, because he says, my sons are inviting my daughters over for a party, and I don't know how they're going to sin, but he's sacrificing to God. His relationship with God is not affected by what's going on. Oh, I see. Whoever's. So right, his relation, right. So the principle that's brought them on the Rambam and others is that there's no psak halacha. There's no we don't have to paskin when it comes to things which are not halacha. So a number of people bring down and they say arguments over theology, over the nature of God, or whether you believe how God's unity is understood to be, or anything like that. These are matters of theology. These are matters which are paskin by the heavenly court. You go up after 120 years, you got it right, you haven't got it right. Why do we need to paskin this? And we can't go start looking into everyone's minds to analyze if they've got a correct belief or not. These are things which we just shouldn't paskin at all. So to me, how can a Beit Din paskin that person X has got an incorrect belief? So proclaiming is different, right? So that's the next. So if you proclaim something, there is certainly enough gemina. There are halachas that, for example, a shochet, someone who slaughters an animal, someone who writes a sefer Torah, it's only valid if they are a believer. If they are a heretic, then it calls into question the validity of the Sefer Torah, the Tefillin, the Shkita. So that's the question. But at least we know that our halachas. The first stage is that our halachas, which deal. So there's a halachic nafkamina, there's a halachic discussion, which means that we can now even someone to lead a public tefillah. So for the first thing to note is that there are halachic differences. Then the question is, well, how does this halachic difference manifest itself? So we've talked about the differences between Mishnah Torah, the Hilchos Teshuvah definitions of heresy, and the definitions that we have in the 13 principles. So Mishnah Torah, as you pointed out, being a halachic work, how does it present it all? Principles of it, right? They're similar. There are overlaps, but not exactly the same.
When you read through the Torah and the Tanakh, you see that Hashem does have a heart.
That's the way it's presented, but as understood by many, that's a mashal, right? So there you got to work through all of his books from A to Z, and the Gaonim who came before him, and everyone else to see why that can't be. I mean, from all the midrashim, for example, that describe God having a body, I'll say something like Kibiyachol. Were it to be possible to say, because it's a mashal, there's some sort of midrash which describes God as riding on a horse around the time of Kriyat Yam Suf, Kibiyachol, because it can't really be that we can describe God in this way. But so when we have these, one second. There are 5 that are called the min, which is one of the categories of heretics. Ha'omer, one who says, saying from Eloika, there's no God, there's no money, there's no gods, although there is a God, but he's not providentially engaged with the world. Ha'omer, one who says, but there are 2 of them. So all of these principles in Hilchos Teshuvah are one who says, which comes back to something you said a minute ago. When it comes to halacha, we can't judge what goes on in someone's head. If someone comes out and states publicly there is no gods, or there are 2 gods, or something like that, we can say, well, we can't allow you to be a shochet, we can't allow you to be to lead a service, something like that. But someone who's at least has doubts or doesn't have the correct beliefs, perhaps. But in terms of halachic psak, he's still allowed to do this, and we don't invalidate things. We don't have to start finding all the shoftim, all the sofrim, and start doing what's it called, this test, polygraph test, to try and work out what they believe or they don't believe. We don't have to do that. Yeah. Whereas when we look at the 13 principles of faith, it's something really different. Laha'amin, Isada Rishon, laha'amin mitziat habaris bara, to believe in the existence of God. So this is a matter of belief, and this is a matter of one who states. Why? Because, as we said, the 13 principles of faith, Rambam is writing according to his own understanding. How does Rambam understand it? Well, if you look at the end, when it gets his conclusion, when a person comes to believe all of these principles, when it's bara and he clarified his ideas in them, then he's part of Yisrael. Yisrael, the way it's defined in the Mishnah at the beginning, and this is the way Rambam writes right the way through his books, that the connection that a person has to God is through the mind, through understanding. And if you have an incorrect belief of what God is, you just don't have that connection. You can have a basic belief, but if you have if you believe that God is up there in the sky and all around the white beard of the body, you're not actually connecting to any real being there. And therefore, since our relationship with God, our connection with God is in this world, is what translates, as we discussed earlier on in these series of shiurim, is what translates into the olam haba. So automatically, if you have the incorrect belief, you have no connection with God, and if you don't have olam haba. So when Rambam's writing his own understanding, these 13 principles are the way is his own understanding, as he states at the end. This is the way I put it together after my own analysis. He's not claiming that this is the simple reading of the Gemara. the 13 principles, he's saying, this is my own understanding. So he writes, L'ha'amin, you have to believe this, or you're not in Olam Haba. Whereas when he's writing Hilchos Teshuvah, this is his legal work, as he stated in his letter to the French rabbis. I don't even need to bring my sources because everything I write here is as it appears in the Gemara and in the Mishnayos. And as we saw right at the beginning of Peker Chelek, where's it gone? Right at the beginning. Right, Elu Hein She'ein Lahem Chelek Olam Haba. Who doesn't have a Chelek Olam Haba? Ha'omer Ein Techias HaMeisim Ein Torah Min HaShamayim. So these are people who say. So when he's doing his legal work as a Rambam with his lawyer's hat on, well, that's the legal source. So that's the statute. So I'm going to copy that down into my legal work, and that's why for centuries and centuries, the work that was used to discuss if someone a heretic or not, in the Shulchan Aruch and all these commentaries, was always the Mishnah Torah, because he's copying down the legal conclusions in the Gemara. Whereas the 13 principles were taken more as a piyut, again, it was always learned and people found it interesting. They discussed it, but it was never taken to as the sort of right to determine who's a heretic and who isn't. So that's something I found quite interesting.
The thing is when you read through the Torah, number one, created man, and it says, they're making in my image.
Right.
And so, and then you have him walking into the garden and saying, "Hey, where you guys at?" He's walking into the garden.
Right.
So obviously he has legs, he has feet, and he's walking into the garden.
Or not, or all of these are, as the Rambam calls it, Lashon B'nai Adam. These are that we have to have a way of it. And if you look at Unclus, who was a Tana, and the Tanaim, none of them took it literally in this way. If you just see that, if you want to, I can give you a book called Judaism Reclaimed, which has a chapter to explain through the Gaonim, through the Amoraim, through both Jewish and Roman Greek sources showing how the Jews didn't take it that way literally. But okay, right, so we're going to get to this in the third principle. Yeah, hold your. So we'll start the first principle today, and then we will L'ha'amin, so to believe. So again, this is a matter of believing mitzias habari yisbarach. So believing in the existence of God. V'hu sheyesh sham nimtza. So yesh sham is this. You find it in the sort of the Rishonim that spoke Arabic. And sham seems to be some kind of phrase. There is an existence. There is an existent being. Shalom b'chol darchei mitzias. Completely perfect in all ways, in all manners. As we say, all the descriptions we give, but really the Nevi'im say we have no way, we have no means, we have no words which can compare him in any way to anything he's created. He is the cause of all existence and that there is, both the heavens and the earth. Et hashamayim et haaretz, as we say, it's not just the heavens and the earth, everything which was produced or part of those creations. So they were created through him, and their existence is maintained through him. There's a principle that the Rambam talks about, also at the beginning of Mishnah Torah, that God didn't just create the world as a one-off and then that's it. It's the ongoing existence of the world is dependent on God's existence. How that is, we may or may not understand it, but that's we don't have to understand all of it, all the whys. We tend to be able to accept and then try to understand afterwards. We shouldn't even be able to consider or fathom the idea of his lack of existence. Because when he doesn't exist, automatically everything else ceases to exist as well. There cannot be any other existence once he ceases to exist. This is a bit of a longer, it's a bit more of a longer-winded way of saying that he's the only necessary being. This is something which medieval philosophers talked all about there being necessary existence and contingent existence. Everything that we think of and see in the physical world doesn't have to be. This table could not have been made. This light could not have been made. Everything in this world, we didn't have to be here. The world could have been here without us. Whereas God is the only real, true, necessary being, which has to be, and nothing else could be without him. That's how we understand at the beginning of Mishnah Torah the sentence from Yirmiyah, Hashem Elokeichem Emes. Emes doesn't mean he's true. He doesn't lie. It means he is the only true, real being, which has to be. It's a different mode of existence to everything else. It could mean people take it beyond that as well, but yeah, it definitely has that meaning. There's no necessary existence other than him. But I think in the Pasuk, it's just talking about, if you look at the context, it's saying there are no other gods, no other authorities or forces independent of him. I think that's the context. But again, in Drush, it's taken to mean more than that. But in terms of Pshat, it just means there are no other forces. I think it's around the time of Har Sinai, where Moshe is sort of giving the lessons of Har Sinai over to the people before they go into the land, saying, basically at Mount Har Sinai, the heavens were opened up for you. You could see there was this. It was just clear to you that there was no other forces there, and this is the lesson you should be transmitting and passing on to the children. Right, destroy the idols before them to show that he had the power, and these are false gods, right? And even if we could imagine that there could be absolute destruction of all physical existence the way we see it, the way we understand it, that wouldn't have any impact upon God at all. I think that says the pasuk, Hashem lamabul yashav vayeshav Hashem melech ha'olam. God brought a flood which wiped out the whole world. But God was still remaining, dwelling, Melech Olam. And his existence was not at all impacted by the fact that physical existence has stopped. Adon Olam brings out this side. Adon Olam Hashem Alach B'Terem Kol Yitzir. But before anything was created, he was still Melech. He was Hashem Alach B'Terem Kol. One second. So then he created everything, and he was Yikar, he was called Melech, and there's someone to actually address him and relate to him as Melech. But afterwards, when everything ceases to exist, how we understand that to mean? He'll still be Melech. Meaning he, in his own right, is Melech. He's unchanged by everything. We come in and out of existence, and we relate to him in different ways, and we're affected by certain things. But God, the non-contingent, absolutely true existence, is beyond. So he's beyond anything we can fathom, and any attributes we can actually give him. And why? Because we can't really fathom this idea of true existence, which is beyond physicality. Our minds relate to reality based on what we see and touch and is around us, which is physicality. So all we can think of and understand is physicality. So all we can really understand of God is that he is not like anything in this world. It's the way he goes on to the negative theology, that we can only describe truly what God isn't, which gets into there are many people who go into this exactly how to take it and how to understand it. There's a story in the Gemara which really brings out this point. It was Rabbi Hanina, I think. It was in his shul. He was there's a sheikh Tibur got up and he said about Hakela Gadola Gibor Vanara, and he's getting his kavanas, and he starts ad-libbing, and he adds like another 10, 20 adjectives, and he thinks he's doing really well, describing how great God is. And, obviously the more adjectives, the more terms you can bring in, the more you're elevating God. And he gets to the end, and everyone's a bit annoyed, not just because Tefillah's lasted twice as long, but Chania says to him, "What are you doing? Have you completed? You've exhausted all the praises of God? But what are you doing?" Meaning, and he says, all the things that we say about God, they're not accurate descriptions. We can only say them because the prophets perceived some sort of meaning of them. The prophets who saw beyond the physicality, they perceived the spiritual existence. So they were able to understand that these words, they have some kind of meaning in the spiritual universe. They somehow can portray God in the spiritual world. And even then, we can only use them to describe God, because the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, structured our prayer and included them within it. You can't start going and adding more to it. What is it like? You adding your own descriptions and praises of God is like a king who has millions and millions of gold coins. Someone comes along and praises him, saying he's got hundreds of silver coins. He thinks he's praising this peasant is praising God. You know what? He's got hundred. Yeah, someone praising Elon Musk. You know what? He can afford a new car. You think you're praising him because in your little bubble, it's amazing to be able to buy a new car. But really, in terms of Elon Musk, in terms of this king, you're actually insulting him. All I can afford is this, and the Rambam brings it out. The difference is he doesn't just say it goes from 1,000,000 to 100. It's he's got gold coins, and you're praising he's got silver coins. I mean, we don't even understand the currency of God. His existence is so far beyond, we can't start thinking that we can even have the words to describe him and his spiritual existence. All we can say, like the Nevi'im really say, is who can even compare, who can equate? Nothing. So we can know the principle, the truth that we've been told by the prophets, that he's this emes, he's this true, non-contingent existence, which is beyond everything, and he is in existence, and he's manhig, and he's everything out in the world. But this is why it's a principle of faith, because again, we can spend, and we're supposed to spend time thinking about it and understanding it, whether it's through the Rambam, whether it's through Kabbalah. They all try to take these ideas and not just sort of it's not something you can just run through quickly, read something and you understand it. These are these ideas which you have to concentrate on and meditate upon, and then gradually gain insight into. This takes a lifetime's work. I think when the Rambam talks about the greatness of Shlomo HaMelech and Moshe Rabbeinu, he says that the greatness that they had in their perception of God is that they were able to truly understand what God isn't. I mean, we can just say, God's greater than me, God isn't. But they were able to really understand what God isn't. They couldn't understand what God is. He said, Moshe Rabbeinu asks God, show me yourself, God. He's finally had his prayers answered, and he's in this highest place. And God says to him, no one can see my front, only the back of me. And what does the front and the back represent? The way it's explained in the commentaries, when you see the front of something, when you see a person's face, you see their identity, you see their expression, you really see the essence of a person. That no one can see about God. Only me'achorai, God says, the back of me. What is the back of someone? You can see the person's there. You can't see their essence. When you see someone walking, you see the back of them, you know they're there. But you can't see anything about their actual essence, their actual what makes them up, their actual identity. That's lo yiradi adam achai. So even Moshe Rabbeinu, who got the truest upon him, it sounds like it's upon him like that. He can't get the true essence, the true understanding of what God is. Fine. So where did that take us to? He is sufficient in his own existence. He's not reliant upon anything in the world. He doesn't gain anything or need anything. His existence isn't enhanced in any way by anything in this world. Unlike the pagan gods which were understood by sort of sacrificing to them, you're making them stronger, you're appeasing them, you're changing them. Everything other than God, even spiritual entities, even the angels, God's spiritual agents for running the world. It also sometimes angels in Rambam's work. Even the greatest spiritual existences, the angels, they all are dependent in their existence upon God. And this is all within the pasuk Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem your God. He brings a pasuk for each of these. Maybe Yichud we'll leave to next week actually, because it'll do the whole introduction, everything on that. So we'll leave it here with the first principle, and we'll try to get to the second and third at least next week. Maybe second, third, and fourth. Sounds like a good story. You tell us.